Hey, gang! Welcome to Highgate. Now, Highgate is mainly known for its cemetery, potentially the most famous cemetery in the world and definitely one of the most haunted. I'll tell you about the Highgate Vampire towards the end of the video. The Highgate Village is also home to quite a few ghosts, dark deeds, and murder. The bride in the bath killer, stroke here. So Highgate is located in North London, and it's quite a fancy area. You'll spot quite a few nice cars and nice properties. And from some spots, including this bridge, you can have a lovely view over the city. It's very well protected, of course, to avoid people from taking their own lives. Back in the days, Highgate was almost like a spa location. People would come for the good waters, especially drinking water. As you might know, the water in the city was completely polluted. This is Lauderdale House in Waterloo Park. There has been a house on this site for centuries. It was built for a Lord Mayor of London. And it is here that allegedly Nell Gwyn threatened to drop her baby through the window. For the ones that don't know, Nell Gwyn was a famous mistress of Charles II, and she wanted her baby to have a title. It is said that one day in 1670, she held her little toddler Charles Beauclerc over the window, asking the king to give him a title or she would drop him. And that's allegedly how the title, the Dukedom of St. Albans, was created. We are now in the center of Highgate Village on Pond Square. Apparently there used to be a couple of ponds here that had been dug by an ermite. And the square is haunted by the ghost of a chicken. The running chicken has been seen quite a few times. Once through World War II by a soldier that was trying to catch him for his dinner. Another time in the 60s by a courting couple that was sat on a bench here. And quite a few more witnesses. Now we think we know how the chicken met his tragic death. In the early 17th century, Francis Bacon, the philosopher and the scientist, lived here. And he was trying to improve preservation of goods and food. And he thought about the cold, literally freezing. So he went and collected a lot of snow, and he went to see a local farmer, to ask them for a chicken. He plucked the chicken and buried him in the snow to literally try to freeze them. Unfortunately for Bacon, he did not survive it. He caught a cold, he caught pneumonia, and he died in a house on this site. But the chicken has been seen running on this very square ever since. Now, if you don't really believe in ghostly chicken, that's fine. I've got some human ghost for you too. Highgate is home to some fantastic pubs, one of them being called the Flask. Probably called the Flask after the flask of waters that would have been sold around here. As we mentioned earlier, the water in central London was often completely contaminated by cholera, or sometimes even graveyards that were over the water streams. The Flask seems to have a few ghosts, but the most famous one, it's the ghost of a Spanish waitress. Some claim that they've even placed an order with the barmaid, and then she vanished. According to some, the Spanish barmaid was once in love with the owner of the pub, but he refused to leave his wife for her, so she would have hanged herself in the back room. There's no evidence of that, but some people seem to believe it. It is said that the Flask was visited by both Charles Dickens and Dick Turpin, but most old pubs in London claim that they have been visited by those two. If that was true, those two would never have been any productive, either with writing or with crime. Another haunted pub is this one, the Gatehouse. The origins of this pub date back to the 14th century. When the Bishop of London had a gate here, people had to pay to cross his land. It was known as the Highgate, because of course we are, well, quite high, so that's how the village took its name. The pub is said to be haunted by the ghost of Mother Marnes, a widow that was robbed of her life savings and killed. So was her cat, sadly. So the ghost only appears when there's no pets in the establishment. Now, the fascinating thing about this pub is that on the wall you can still see today an old boundary marker, as you see here, Hornsey Parish. You might know before the 1960s, London had many more boroughs. They were pretty much the church parishes. So the pub was basically sat between two different jurisdictions. It is said that they had a rope inside to stop criminals crossing the line, because at the time the watchman would be different from one parish to the next, so they could just escape to a different jurisdiction. Let's head to Waterloo Road, a lovely residential street today. But it is here in 1914 that the horrible story of the Brides in the Bath killer came out. Now, if we go back to the beginning of the 20th century, there were a lot of single ladies. There were actually a shortage of men because, some have already, they had already enlisted in the army, and a lot of ladies were worried they might stay single. At the time, pretty much the whole point of a lady's life was to marry and have kids. And because of the shortage of men, a lot of ladies were desperate to marry. And very sadly, that was the case with Margaret. Margaret was 38 at the time, so quite quite old for a single lady at the time. She had just been through some kind of a love deception the year before, because she found out that the gentleman that was courting her was actually already married. And she was starting to be scared of, being left on the shelf. And at the time, there were some horrible terms for those ladies, like spinsters or old maid. And Margaret didn't want it to happen to her. When she met a man on the streets, she kept the story quiet from her family because, she didn't want to worry them. And it turned up that they married very quickly. And that man that she knew as George Lloyd convinced her to change her will and to get an insurance, a life insurance. She went to get the insurance and she said she had no intention to marry. A few days later, they were married. They decided to move to London. They were going to move into a different boarding house. At the time you had those boarding houses where you could rent a room. Well, still today. We still have a lot of flat shares today. And they were going to move somewhere else, but George complained that there was no bathtub. He expected a bathtub. And the lady, anyway, did not want him. She felt a bit worried about him. Then eventually they moved here, at number 14. I'm not going to show you the exact location because I'm not quite sure that there could have been a remembering of the streets. Often in the streets with a famous murder, they change the numbers. And what happened here, it's that Margaret and George had literally just moved in the night before. George asked the landlady if she knew of a good doctor in the area, because Margaret had been feeling very unwell. Apparently her head was, she had a headache. And so she sent them to a doctor on Archway Road, a bit further down the street. They came home, and the next morning, Margaret requested to take a bath. So the landlady had to bring out up all those, those buckets of hot water. Margaret got in the bath, and a few minutes later, the door slammed, so someone went out. And a few minutes after that, someone knocked at the door. The landlady went to open the door, and it turned up that it was George. He had
as he said, run to buy some tomatoes for Margaret, but he forgot his keys. The landlady had heard a little splash in the bathtub, like if maybe Margaret was washing her hair or something. And George went upstairs to find Margaret dead in the bathtub. She had sadly drowned. At the time, they didn't see anything suspicious with the death. The doctor put it down as an accident. And as it was published in the newspapers, someone in a different town, in Blackpool actually, found the story a little bit too familiar. That's what happened to a young lady over there a year earlier. And that young lady, she had also drowned in her bathtub right after her wedding. And what a coincidence, she had also just contracted a life insurance. The husband went under a different name. He was known as George Smith. And Alice Burnham, her name was, they didn't see much much suspicious about the death at the time, but someone wrote to Scotland Yard with a clipping of the newspaper from the time in Blackpool, and informing the police that it was too much of a coincidence. 2 brides killed in their bath days after getting married. So the police officer, of course, found it very suspicious. And a few days later, or a few weeks later, they heard about another case. A lady in Kent, Bessie Mundy, 4 years earlier. Guess how she died? In her bathtub as well, accident. And again, her husband left with all the money. Now, the police was convinced that it had to be the same man, and they indeed got a photograph of the groom, and it was definitely the same guy, although he went with a different name. But how to catch him? The guy had disappeared. So they actually told the doctor to tell the insurance companies that there was nothing suspicious about Margaret's death. That way, he would get the money from the insurance. So he would have to go and see his solicitors to get the money on the inheritance and all that. So they actually monitored the solicitor's office until finally the guy came. The police arrested him. They were like, "Are you George?" "Yes." "Are you George Lloyd?" "Yes." "Are you also George Smith?" "Oh." So they arrested him, but then to actually prove it was quite complicated, because there was no proof of any foul play in the bodies. They exhumed the 2 other brides, and eventually they had to invite professional divers, ladies about the same build, to see how they could possibly drown in such a small bathtub. Apparently, before to move to the lodging house in Blackpool, he had complained about the size of the bathtub. It was too small, he said. But he said, I suppose someone could still lay in there. And eventually at court, there was a complicated case, because at the time, you could only be tried for 1 murder. The police at the time and the authorities thought, you know what, you can only be hanged once. Because at the time, there was always the capital punishment, right? And this case was actually the first case in which they allowed evidence from the 2 other murders to be considered at court. They actually tried him for the case of Bessie, so the case in Kent, but they heard evidence about the 2 other case, and they actually proved at court with that professional diver that if he grabbed her feet from the back and then maybe gently pushed her head underwater, with the shock, she'll die almost instantly. Even the diver at court, well, I say at court, it was not really at court, it was in the back room at court, because at the time it was, of course, unacceptable to have a lady in a swimwear in front of all those men. But the young lady had to be resuscitated when they tried to do the test. So that was enough. He was indeed guilty and he was hanged at Maidstone Prison in 1915.
So if you hear about the brides in the bath killer, this is the very street where he got caught. Now, of course, the most famous part of Highgate, it is Highgate Cemetery. It was opened in 1839. It's part of the Magnificent Seven. So those amazing garden cemeteries were created on the outskirts of London because at the time London struggled to bury its dead. Thanks to the Industrial Revolution, in the last 40 years, the population of London had doubled already. The little traditional graveyards by the churches, they were completely saturated and very smelly. So this is why this amazing Gothic cemetery was created. Potentially his most famous resident and most visited grave, it is the one of Karl Marx. Highgate is infamous because of its ghost, and maybe even a vampire. The true story that might have influenced people into even considering vampires, it is the story of Elizabeth Seidel. Lizzie, also known as Lizzie Rossetti, was the wife and muse of the artist, a painter and a poet, Dante Gabriel Rossetti. When Lizzie passed away, Rossetti was so depressed that he decided to bury with her a book of his best poems, a unique copy of those poems. And 7 years later, he changed his mind. He wanted to publish a book of his best work, so he had to get the poems back. So Lizzie, sadly, had to be exhumed. When they opened her casket, Lizzie was there, as beautiful as she was the day she was buried 7 years earlier. Perfectly preserved, you could still see her beautiful red hair. Rossetti never fully recovered from having done that to his wife, and he actually fell into drugs. Much later on, the story of the Highgate vampire actually started right here on Swain's Lane. That used to be known as Swine Lane, but the Victorians, they changed it. They were a bit overly sensitive, let's say, so they decided swine was a bit dirty, so they changed it to Swains. Now, in the 60s, the cemetery was actually in a bad state. The London Cemetery Company had gone bankrupt. And the cemetery was a bit overgrown with nature. And you'd have to remember that in the 60s, there was a bit of witchcraft and Satanism revival. Some people at the time seemed to be fascinated by the occult. There had been some horrible desecration in a cemetery in Tottenham, so not too far. And one night in the late 60s, two young teenagers were walking home on Swain's Lane when they claimed they saw bodies levitating out of the cemetery walls. One of them, her name was Elizabeth, she was interviewed by an expert of the occult called Sean Manchester. She claimed that she was feeling very tired, like if the life was being extracted out of her. Now, Sean Manchester and David Farrant from the British Occult Society, they went crazy for the case. One of them even slept in the cemetery. And it became a massive hysteria in the media. And we're talking the mass media, the newspapers at the time. Mr. Manchester was convinced it was a vampire. There was a duel between those two experts and the media craze. People went crazy about the Highgate vampire. Manchester had publicly said that the only way to stop that was to find the body and stick a stake through his heart and cut his head off. Sadly, that led to more desecration and more vandalism in Highgate and more cemeteries in London. David Farrant ended up being arrested. With very little evidence, they claim that he had destroyed some of the monuments. When being arrested, they found in his home some photographs of graffitis. But it's not because you take a photograph of a graffiti that you are necessarily the author of the graffiti. And at that time, in the early 70s, a lot of dead foxes had been found dead into the cemetery. Some claimed it was the vampire. Some claimed that it was some Satanist teenager killing them. Some local cats also went missing. And some accused David Farrant of doing some cats' sacrifices. The RSPCA got involved, and some say that David did a voodoo doll of an RSPCA representative. But all of that created like a mini wave of Satanism. And actually, in the 70s, we had a few new Dracula movies coming out. Manchester later on published a book, and he met another young girl that had the same symptoms as Elizabeth, all of which was probably massively romanticized by those two. Whatever really happened on this lane in the late 60s and 70s, we probably will never know. But what we know for sure is that there have been quite a few sightings on this very lane. Because after the teenage girls, there was a couple that saw a tall figure. One gentleman also saw a 7-foot-tall black figure with red eyes staring at him, and also a ghostly bicycle, like a vintage bicycle with a ghost riding it. And one night, after a TV broadcast of the two, so Manchester and Farrant having an interview about the case, there was a massive hysteria and hundreds of people went down to the cemetery at night, climbing over the gate. They went vampire hunting. The police tried to stop them, but that didn't work. Sean Manchester, by the way, is allegedly a straight descendant of Lord Byron. Well, that's what he claims at least. We will never know what really happened there. What we do know is that, of course, it made Highgate one of the most famous cemeteries in the world. And a lot of visitors come today every day to visit this amazing cemetery. If you did want to come and visit, you have the Friends of Highgate Cemetery now that run tours in there. Hope you enjoyed that little video of the dark tales of Highgate. If you wanted to see a little bit more of me, do check out my live section. Most of what I do on YouTube is actually live streaming. Hope to virtually see you there. Bye!